Anne Alonzo, Bruce Haynes, thanks so much for joining us today. NACD spends a lot of time, attention, and energy thinking and working in the area of board culture. It can absolutely impact the corporate governance of an organization. It's so critical. And often that culture can be influenced by a diversity of, let's say, disruptors that might come in its view. Today, perhaps more than ever, we have instances of geopolitical tension, our own political climate here in the United States, justice protests and the like. I'm wondering, what have the observations been in your own worlds around this and how boards are handling those? Can I go first to you, Anne?
Sure. Thank you, Susan, and thank you for the invite, NACD. So we're definitely living in a more complex world. We have Helene, the hurricane, we have Middle East conflict, the dock, workers and crime, fentanyl, and the list goes on. And with information that's available in real time. So this, I think, requires board members to be more aware and up to date on external going-ons and these impacts to their companies that they oversee. And I personally find myself, spending at least an hour and a half daily just going through the Wall Street Journal and Agribiz journals and et cetera to be informed and to keep up to speed. And I guess the point I want to make is that I don't think it's no longer the situation where what traditionally comes before a board, like financials and executive comp and share repurchases and M&A, but rather a more broader awareness of how these external disruptors can possibly impact companies and their employees and their stakeholders. And so I believe that the role of a fiduciary and oversight over a company's long-term value to a company and its stakeholders has expanded significantly. And that's where I see all of these issues impact board governance and board culture.
Bruce, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, and thanks also, Susan. And, I would just say, I believe the big conversation that a lot of these things have forced is this idea of the reexamination of the purpose of the business enterprise. The why we are here is now extending well beyond just share value and revenue, and margins, but what is the role of the enterprise in society? And I think this is a good conversation to have from what I would call the inside out perspective, where it's driven by the nature of your enterprise, the people that are in it, and a really good strategic perspective on how your business fits into society. I think what drives boards and enterprises crazy is when it frustrates them is when it's driven by the outside in perspective, where it's being forced on you by groups that are not really stakeholders of your enterprise, but are attempting to act upon you to make their own point. And I think that's why it's really critical to know where you should and should not engage, and to have a rigorous process and develop a sophisticated framework and structure for choosing where, how, and most importantly, why to engage on these kinds of issues.
Bruce, you just mentioned a rigorous process, and you both mentioned a world larger than just our own boardroom. Anne, you spoke about stakeholder responsibility really expanding significantly in this era. And Bruce, you mentioned even looking at how our business fits into society. Both of those make us put on our glasses around big lens, 50,000 feet beyond. So what are some of those? You touched on the processes just now, Bruce. Let me ask you, what are some of those procedures, policies, processes that a board needs to examine and perhaps implement in order to navigate this challenging new time?
Yeah, I really think you have to look inside. And let me just say, first of all, it's most important to do this in the time of calm, when you can assess things rationally, than when the evil spirits have been visited upon you by external events. The old saying back when I did exclusive crisis management is you don't want to let your issue become a crisis. So I am a strong proponent of taking the time and investing the resources in engaging internal and external experts and creating a rigorous process and a framework and a structure to determine, what is relevant to you and your stakeholders. When should engage? What are those tripwires and trigger points? It should be done comprehensively. It should be on an annual basis and updated regularly, probably at least quarterly. Some of the best ones that I've worked on and seen almost take the posture of looking like they're a heat map, on a grid of the external disruption and the internal consequence, and looking at, sometimes the biggest external issue may not really be one that you need to respond to and that's really relevant to your employees or your stakeholders. But sometimes things that seem small on the outside are pretty big on the inside. And so making sure you have asked those questions, assess what really does present risk and create real disruption and impact, both your short and long-term share value is very, very important.
I love your phrasing on that when you talk about something small on the outside could be big on the inside. It makes me think of that old phrase from our horror movies, the call is coming from inside the house. And tell me what happens when it is inside the house, when you have experience on a number of boards. When have you seen something that you can speak to around the discussion going a bit right or a bit wrong? If it's off the rails, how do you get it back on? Or how do you stay within that respectful collegial board structure and posture if there's an internal disagreement?
Yeah, thank you. And I would divide this into inside the boardroom and outside the boardroom in terms of processes and procedures to help boards navigate, especially difficult conversations. So inside the boardroom, I think, there's board guidelines that we adhere to. And I think we haven't spoken about the role of the chairman or the lead director, who I think, are very important to set the tone and help guide the conversation. And I think this is critical. But I think Bruce touched on this. Board agendas, when we meet for board meetings, they're packed with essential board business that we need to get through in a very short period of time. And so, we don't often have the luxury or the time to spend on non-material conversations. This is not, we're not sitting around our kitchen table or with friends at a watch party. We are, trying to get through a lot of really important business. So I think inside the boardroom, guidelines and a lead director and a chairman are critically important. Outside the boardroom, we have board dinners, we have board retreats. But, and also at these dinners and retreats, the boards I sit on, our board members, usually do not focus on board business. They talk about, what's going on in the world, pop culture, movies, vacations, and yes, politics. But I have found that, the board, boards I sit on and the members that I serve with are, infinitely professional, polite, and I've not to date experienced a challenging conversation, but I think it's important to realize that, these conversations go on inside the boardroom and outside the boardroom. And it's really important to have some processes and some referees, if you will, to help guide the discussion.
Anne, you just touched on politeness, professionalism. I'm curious from your perspective inside the boardroom, and also, Bruce, your expertise in this area, what kind of communication skills do board members need to nurture in themselves and have walking into that dinner the night before the board meeting or the retreat, what have you, to engage in conversations that can touch up against difficult topics?
Yeah, I guess I'll go. I think just, advancing boardroom diplomacy, where folks are open to listening, to seeking common ground, and to checking their egos, if you will, at the door. And also, as I mentioned earlier, being educated and aware of what's going on, I think makes for, interesting conversations and just a respectful, situation, if you will, amongst different board members.
Yeah, I agree with that. You really do have to be able to listen well. One thing I find frustrating is when people think of communication skills too often, we think of talking, presenting, convening. But the first and most neglected skill is listening and being able to stand in the shoes, of the enterprise's stakeholders and understand, how to explain your motives as an enterprise and how they're aligned with other people's interests. And you have to understand their interests. As you said, you have to be educated. I also think you have to have empathy in the true sense of being able to respect the needs and interests of others, and be able to integrate and synthesize your perspectives and other people's perspectives to develop, solutions. If you're pro-life, but let's say you're in a business that's in a retail establishment, it's located primarily in an urban area or urban areas, and it has a young and diverse workforce, you're going to have to set aside your personal convictions and understand that the business is likely to put some policies in place to support those interests that you might not personally agree with. So, having that sense of being a perspective, I think, is the good word of being the fiduciary of the enterprise is really, really important.
Bruce, it's uncanny you should bring that up, because I was about to just drift to that topic in my own mind. I can't help but think of organizations, Hobby Lobby, Tractor Supply, where customers' reactions to the companies have impacted things all the way to the boardroom. And likewise, we've seen in recent years that politicians and governments may have interaction with companies and CEOs. I think of Florida, of Disney, and those issues leak outside the boardroom and beyond and can become quite controversial. So I just wonder if you can tell me about that risk, how one might mitigate it, and where that line is between healthy discourse and concern.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you do have to listen. You have to hear it and see it coming. It should filter into those processes that you create, and you can begin to prepare for them. But when it happens, you can't let external stakeholders run your company. You have to do all those things, but you have to, navigate them in a way that it's good for your enterprise or your business environment. I think a good example was Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, the Yale professor's list of companies that were continuing to do business in Russia after the Ukraine conflict blossomed into a war. That was foreseeable. And you could prepare for it, and you could look at your supply chains, and you could look at your market and your customers and understand what the impacts of those things were and develop mitigations in advance. And so many companies were caught flat-footed. And we can say the same things about the Middle East. We can say the same things about China and Taiwan, and we can say the same things about decisions like the Dobbs case that we all saw coming. And I had a client there that was prepared with responses for every stakeholder set, what their policies were going to be, and their focus was on taking care of their people. And even though it came out on a Friday afternoon, they were able to act swiftly and surely and pass that test with flying colors.
And Bruce just mentioned his client having responses pre-locked and loaded for various stakeholders and reactions. What do you think from the inside of the boardroom perspective? How much do boards, do you think, take the time on those packed agendas to think that through carefully and work on each of those responses in today's political environment where those issues are coming at us fast and furiously?
Well, I think it also goes to, what's the role of the board and when should it get involved? I mean, not all situations should they be being the head of corporate affairs, but I think there's some situations where they definitely should weigh in and input. And, I followed Tractor Supply, the situation with that Tennessee-based company quite closely. And that's an interesting case where they made a decision to withdraw their, emission reduction goals and kind of eliminate, DEI type jobs. And I guess Bruce mentioned it, this was because people pushed back. There was a podcaster that, levied a multi-week campaign. And so, they withdrew and retreated, and and I think that's the point is that I think that, on milestone decisions, on important decisions such as your carbon emissions and, what you're doing in the DEI space, I mean, I think that lends itself to very thoughtful consideration and discussion at the board level. But then once you land, then you stay the course. Because in the Tractor Supply case, there was a lot of pushback because of the retreat. I think 18% of its employees were of LGBTQ persuasion, and many of its board members were diverse, and they were looking in terms of their growth to look at millennials and and women, because, a lot of their clients were older and men and conservative. So I guess the point is, be very thoughtful about what you agree to, and then, stay the course. I have an example on one of my boards, when I had just joined. Um, there was a sustainability report that we hadn't reviewed as a board. And I, tentatively raised my hand and said, I think it's important that we review this, because I thought that was one of the milestone situations where, we were making all types of claims and commitments and being very public, and we were going to be held to this. And so we needed to be sure that at the board and strategic level, we were comfortable and not, later think about retreating. So that's, that's my response to that.
It sounds like it takes a sort of, combination of courteousness and courage to raise your voice in that way. How often does that happen?
Well, I have two examples when it happened to me. I gave you one, but I have others. I was also brand new to another board, and we had to agree to a 140-page ESG report. And it was put at the very end of the agenda. And then the chief ESG officer had like 5 minutes to rush through it. And so during the executive session, I raised my hand and I said, because the question was, what can we do better, at the board meeting? And I said, I respectfully pointed out that we gave short shrift to this very important document. And I even thought, am I out of line here? But I didn't care. I just sort of, went ahead and posed those questions. And I asked a fellow board member, whether that was, in line with his thinking. And he said, Anne, this is exactly why you were brought onto this board. And the good news is that the concern was noted, and at every meeting thereafter on the agenda was a discussion of the ESG and sustainability commitments, and sufficient time was allotted. And in fact, the next time we met, there was a special dinner where the ESG officer just spoke about our sustainability and climate commitments. And so I think that was a great example of speaking up, and, folks noting, and I think it was done in a respectful way, and I think it was adhered to and noticed.
Yes, Susan, you mentioned that word courage, and thinking back to many of the crises I've been involved in, that sits no more powerfully with anyone than the lead independent director. They are oftentimes in the best position and best situated to ask the really tough questions that need to be asked and get to the bottom of some things, when in a lot of situations, and this is something for other directors to watch out for, folks want to defend the going practice, the existing culture. And that independence is really important oftentimes in navigating situations and getting through them. And if you provide, whether you change things or not, and asking those tough questions, you provide a valuable role, I believe, in, creating that environment for a conversation where the different opinions can come out and you can get to the right place.
Yeah. Bruce and Anne, both of you mentioned roles on the board. You just spoke about the critical role of lead independent director. Anne, you spoke about the chair, and I think also touched on the lead director. And we have a lot of board members who are probably listening to this podcast thinking, oh, well, I've got a combined chair and CEO, top leader in my organization, versus we're wondering if we should split that role or not, and it's important to think about, as you said earlier, Bruce, when the sun is shining and everything's great, that's one thing. But when we get into these critical conversations, these challenging experiences, we want to have that really our house in order around what each role is. And what comes up for me when you guys are talking, and I heard phrases like it, merits some thoughtful consideration, especially when you're discussing the Tractor Supply issue, Anne. And Bruce, you talked about listening carefully and that being a great superpower in the boardroom. I just can't help but go back to this idea of, we talked about there's internal and there's external. Let's talk about internal for a minute. You're at that board meeting and you're giving something that thoughtful consideration we just mentioned was warranted. How to keep that process healthy when there seem to be so many third rails in these conversations, whether it's what Tractor Supply or similar companies should do about something, what happens when issues come in from the outside world and we have someone sounding off in the boardroom and we want to keep it polite and respectful, and where that line goes from healthy process and diversity of thought to bias and partisan view, and how to keep our radar up for that.
Yeah, I would say, Susan, first and foremost, you've got to stay focused on principles and not politics. And, passion is okay, but you can't be personal. You got to stay focused on the reason you're there. You're there to preserve the value of the enterprise for itself and the stakeholders that rely on it. You've got to be respectful. It's difficult conversations are healthy, but a difficult conversation has ended well when it's ended with respect and people have listened to each other and you've found a way to move forward together. And that's, it's sort of funny because that's actually an important thing to be able to do, and having those respectful conversations actually let you make a decision. Some of the worst situations you see are the ones where it's impossible to make a decision. And the reality, of course, is that not making a decision is making a decision.
Right.
That usually freezes you in place, ends up with a bunch of bad public relations around it, unhappy employees, and then you end up making a decision anyway and have taken on all that water. So I think you're talking about something that's really important is being able to navigate those conversations with respect and putting, principles out front and not being personal.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that the reality, and I said it before, of these board meetings is that the agendas are very packed with essential business that needs to get passed, the budget, executive comp, an M&A, purchase, if you will. So the reality is that there's not often a lot of time for, discussions of a partisan nature, if you will. And I think the key is that the discussions should all be material to the business and to, what you have to get through during that board meeting. And I think, that is more often the case, I believe, than not.
Yeah. I've got some great phrases there, both of you, that are really relevant. One of them is, my dog was just barking. I'm going to run that question again, Jesse. So I picked up some interesting phrases that you guys just both dropped into the room here, as it were, about focusing on principles, not politics, that it's okay to be passionate, but not personal. And this is, listen, at the Thanksgiving dinner table, we can all have a hard time keeping to that, let alone at a board meeting where people's agendas are so pressured and stressed. As you said, Anne, there could be an M&A question hanging in the balance and so forth. So I'll bring up an example I happen to know, and I'll note that we are recording this podcast in early October of 2024. So the political conventions in the United States are behind us. The election is a month away from us. And I happen to know that you mentioned in an earlier phone call as we were planning this conversation that you had attended the DNC convention personally in August. And I just wonder if and how your political alignment, which admittedly is rather public now, might have affected, I'm not going to ask about your view, about the view of your fellow board members and how they might perceive your intentions and interact with you, and how you engage politically in your quote unquote regularly scheduled life, and also ensure that you come into the boardroom in a way that is appropriately collaborative. Maybe the word is neutral. I don't know. How would you tell me about that in your experience?
Yeah, so I did attend the convention. This was about my fourth or fifth convention, I forget, in my hometown of Chicago. And it was, you probably all saw it on TV. It was energizing. They were calling it the Coachella of conventions. Everybody wanted to be there. But I also saw a lot of Republican friends there. And and the convention is not limited to being a Democrat. In fact, I watched both conventions very, very closely. And I think people, that are interested in our country and our issues impacting our leadership, are probably paying close attention in a nonpartisan way. But, to your point, I did pause. I posted this on LinkedIn, pictures, if you will, but I had to think about whether or not I would do just that. But, I was very neutral, and I just posted that, I was part of the convention, and, and both, Democrats and Republicans commented, if you will. I think I got about over 8,000 views. But as to how my fellow board directors reacted, we had, in fact, a meeting the following week after the convention. And I would say that my fellow board members were genuinely very interested in, the experience, what happened. Many of them had watched it on TV, and many had never been to a convention. So I think it was very positive. My political affiliation also is no surprise. I served in 4 federal government agencies, and 2 of them, the Obama and Clinton administrations. And frankly, I think this is part of the value that I bring to the boards, is my understanding and my experience with public policy and government, and being a diverse member to the table. And I think that that's probably what a lot of board members feel, is that this can only enhance our understanding, and this is, important, and adds value to our understanding of external goings on and their impacts to our company.
To an extent, what I hear you also saying is, listen, my roles in the Clinton and Obama administrations were clearly on my CV when the Nomination and Governance Committee interviewed me for these board roles. So, maybe this is a question from you, Bruce, from your perch. How does that play into a board's decision around bringing someone into the boardroom, offering them a seat that's so coveted around that table, when they know they have a certain experience set that aligns on one side of the aisle or the other?
I agree with Anne that boards are more desirous than ever of bringing in someone who understands, this piece of the external environment that all of our enterprises operate in. And it's really important to have that perspective and experience. It's part of the diverse makeup that boards should have now, and particularly as our government, here and governments globally have grown and grown, and they have more regulatory authority, more legislative authority. Their ability to impact the license to operate in the enterprise is larger now, more than ever. And, I think it's certainly incumbent upon board members to come in and, bring your expertise, but not your partisanship. So, kind of going back to your purpose and not partisanship in the way that you do that. I think it's really critical. And, one way to make sure I think that happens, and Anne was hit on this a little bit earlier when she was referring to the things that boards do outside the boardroom, is really providing time and space for relationships between board members, for views to kind of become known outside of tense, time-sensitive moments inside the boardroom, that their experiences are shared. They build trust when you're not in crisis mode. So, does your onboarding process allow for some of those relationships to get built as opposed to just pouring business knowledge into people? I think those types of things are important.
In each of these conversations, and even in the podcast that I've been privileged enough to host for NACD, each of the conversations seems to ultimately come back to that point you just made, Bruce, that these board dinners are not for nothing. It's not just for the chicken and the candlelight or whatever it might be. It's because we're building actual relationships with colleagues who we're going to be in tight situations with, sometimes really in some hot water. And we want to make sure that we know them, that we build that rapport. So it's interesting how I've just noted that so many different topics have hit the microphones here at this podcast, and yet so often it comes back to this issue of trust that you just mentioned. And also that takes time and space, as you put it. So those are worthy investments. I'm wondering, go ahead, Bruce.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's right. And, we were talking earlier about having processes in place. It's also important for boards to invest the time to learn to trust the management. Because as Anne said, so many things are going to be presented in these tight, intense time frames. And it's going to be difficult to really dig down deep into what's in the briefing book and what's brought for you in that 5 or 10 minute segment of the agenda. And just in the same way you want to know and trust your fellow board members, you want to know and trust the senior executives to the extent that you can that are presenting you with information. Because oftentimes that's what you're relying on to make decisions that can have monumental impacts on the enterprise.
Yeah, beautifully said. One other thing that comes up for me that I'll sample from what you said was it's incumbent upon us to bring people onto our board and focus on the expertise, not the partisanship. Or maybe that wasn't your exact phrasing, but the word struck me that you said were expertise, not partisanship. And to anyone who's listening to this discussion, that might give us pause to check ourselves, to say, yeah, am I calling upon my expertise in the way in which brings the highest and best value to this board? Because we can slip into partisanship so often without realizing it clearly. We are reacting. We are seeing something that seems out of whack to us. And again, I'll call upon the incredible timing of this discussion being a month before the United States election. And I just wonder, to each of you, I'll go to you, Anne, first, and then to Bruce. What advice might you have for boards at this juncture in particular, helping companies navigate the election season and prepare perhaps for its aftermath?
Yeah, lots of pieces of advice. One of them, and I also had a different hat. My last operating role in corporate America, I was the SVP of External Relations for a Fortune 500. And so I thought a lot about this a lot. But one of the pieces of advice I'd give is that if they haven't already, to ask for a briefing by the government affairs or corporate affairs staff to the board, and to start looking at questions like, what are the election risks to the company, safety-wise and reputational, and both at the presidential and at the state level? We have a lot of elections coming up in November. And also, depending on where the company's located, is there going to be any trouble, to our facility or to our employees? Is there going to be a peaceful transfer of power? I mean, there's swing states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I got that right. Are we located there? What are our emergency or our security, measures in place? What is the company currently doing in this space? Who is it supporting with its PAC monies? What are our trade associations doing? And I think importantly, how are our employees being supported in their efforts to vote? I think this is all critically important. And I know, we got sent around to us earlier that election risk is high on most board members' lists. NACD in its quarterly survey that just came out, this is a top business issue, and it's moved, I think, to number 6 from 11.
Yeah.
And that is the U.S. election. And I know I read an Ernst & Young survey recently that lists that half of board directors rank political risk among the 5 board priorities in 2024, even above cyber and U.S., China, and the Middle East. So this is very, very important. So I think that the advice is get a briefing, understand, your footprint in this space, and be prepared.
Yeah, I just add a couple of quick things. We've mentioned scenario planning. If I were a board member, I'd ask to see an executive summary of that work. And if we don't have that work, I'd ask to understand when and how it's going to be done. And then, I think you want to focus less on outcomes, because I think that's where partisanship can get wound up, and more on what are the needs of your critical stakeholders when it comes to those outcomes. If Trump wins or Harris wins, or we have divided government, and there are certain, extracurricular things as we've seen happen with election results, and focus less on what you want to say and more on what your stakeholders need to hear from you. And just having a clear-eyed view of where your business or your industry stands with respect to the outcome. I always like to say, don't lead a parade in which you do not have a band.
Well, that's some beautiful wisdom collectively from both of you. Thank you. Is there anything that you'd want to share in closing that speaks not just to the boards, but to those who are listening who either have simultaneously to their board service a C-suite position or management of some kind around one's opportunity versus one's responsibility, when you open your mouth, when the company opens its mouth, anything you might say around that judgment call?
When the company opens its mouth, and we talked about, instances with the Tractor Supply and I think Disney and others. I mean, this may present itself to board members. I thought about this a lot when I was in my operating role in external relations at a Fortune 500. But, you have this Edelman Trust Barometer, for example, that I always followed, where a lot of folks, employees, 50% of them believe that CEOs should be speaking out on issues, or consumers, 53% of the folks think that you should. But I would caution that there be some discipline and some criteria and guideposts in place, when considering whether your CEO or your company speaks out on a social issue. And, basic test, which is, does the issue that we're looking at align with our mission? Does it align with our values and our business strategy? Can we even meaningfully influence the issue? And what are other stakeholders and constituent expectations? I think that's so important, as you assess whether to speak out. So I got a quote for you too, Bruce, and this is one I always remember, and it's by Plato, and which is, wise men speak because they have something to say. Fools because they have to say something. And we don't want to be fools. We want to be very thoughtful about whether this is, a fight or an issue that we want to be very public on, and some of these guideposts. So that's what my closing would be in terms of whether you're faced with speaking out as a company, to be very thoughtful about, and to evaluate whether this is something you should or want to speak out on.
See, look how easy it is. Anne's a Democrat. I'm a Republican, but we've been listening to each other. We've been talking, and we found so much to agree on here in this podcast. It can be done. It can be done.
Beautiful. Well, I think that's a perfect place for us to wrap up. I'll take a cue from Plato and not say much more myself. And thank you both so much for your time and good energy on this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.